So let's begin. I'm going to have to leave a little bit early today, by just a few minutes. But we're going to begin. Nice to see everybody. We had a class a few weeks ago, but that was just a one-off, and this is really our beginning again after the holidays. So it's here we are, and we're continuing to do what we did over the summer and just before. And this is look at these early generations of leaders of the rabbinic period, and both their spiritual leadership and what they believed and thought and prayed, and also their political leadership as they were dealing with trying to bring the Jewish people back to life after the catastrophe of the destruction of the temple. And the first generations that we already read, they were all happening amidst, or at least the later ones, Rabbi Akiva, were happening amidst the second catastrophe, which is the Bar Kokhba revolt. So you have the destruction of a temple, and you have the Bar Kokhba revolt afterwards. That after its failure, the Romans really destroy many more Jewish institutions and exile hundreds of thousands, and leaves the Jewish people even more broken. But so we're going to start today, and we'll probably end up spending a few times study the stories of Yehudah HaNasi. So Yehudah HaNasi was the compiler of the Mishnah. He's the one who put, hey, come in. So Norma just joined me in person, and Alan is out of town, so you're the designated reader.
Oh, okay.
We're not starting yet.
Okay.
We're almost there.
Okay.
Somebody else. Okay. So we're going to be studying about Rabbi Yehudah HaNasi, and he's the one who kind of took before him all of Judaism's traditions were oral, right? So you learn, just like today, should you, how do you learn something about how to be Jewish in our days? A lot of it is, well, you watch other people doing it, right? You watch either people in your family, or you come to shul and do I stand or do I sit for the Shema? Well, I see Vladimir is standing and others are sitting, so I come up with my own tradition, right? And
well, you've said you can do what you want.
Right? You can do what you want, and it's how the strict, but there were the traditions were just handed over before, and people transmitted them person to person, and they were alive, right? When you transmit a tradition from person to a person, they always change a little bit. What's that game that you play when you're a child? The telephone, right? And once you get across, it's totally different, right? So it's the same with the tradition. So traditions were alive, but then at a certain point, and he's the one who did this, the person we're going to be studying, he said, you know what? That maybe the Jewish people are in such danger, or maybe because we need to ensure we're all working from the same manual. He came down and put all the oral traditions and created the Mishnah, and he's the one who wrote it all down and made sure that was all properly redacted. And his father started before him. His father was also a patriarch, a head of all the rabbis at the time. So the Mishnah then becomes the most important text after the Bible, right? The most canonized text. And we have the Bible, the Tanakh, and then we have the Mishnah, and then the Talmud, and that's really our canon. And then you can add later texts. But so Rabbi Yehudah, he did a lot. And we're going to be reading today. There's a lot of stories about him, and they're kind of dense. They're not the easiest stories, but they're interesting. We're going to start reading about him and see how we feel about this guy. Anybody have any thoughts from last time or other times, or anything I want to share before we begin? Anybody? what does everybody think about writing down traditions? Is it better to write down traditions or to keep them alive?
I think we didn't do enough of keeping them alive. That's why we're in the place where we are today.
Do you want to say more?
Write them down. If you write them down, then your memory becomes lazy, right? I mean, David, isn't this a dialogue in Greek thought, right? Do we write stuff down or do we continue to memorize it? Because memorizing it actually keeps it alive, and writing it down makes people's memories lazy, and then they forget where it is, and so it requires constant study, right? So there are debates to support either way.
Like the little kids who have studied the Quran and went to these temples, you know, in these countries, and these little kids from 5 and on, they can recite the entire Quran. So then it keeps getting passed on. Whereas if they write it down, well, I'll look at it tomorrow, I'll check it out. And you forget to check it out.
But if you only pass it along verbally, then you rely on people's memory. And not everybody has a good enough memory to be able to remember the whole Quran or to remember even one of the Platonic dialogues. So it turns out that people with less of a memory then have access to it, and it gets passed on. At least at a certain point, it gets formalized, written down, and you have it. Written down is much easier.
Well, so we need both. We need both.
We need both. Yeah, but I mean, how many of us can remember verbatim things that we were taught in school or we've heard or anything? I mean, it's very, very difficult.
We think we remember them verbatim, but so part of it is also, right, when you record something down, then you stop having lots of different versions, right? So before you write it down, you know, you have this person's version and this person's version and this person's version. And so that also gives you more flexibility because, right, this is still the way halakha worked for a long time. But the old saying is, if you want, let's say you wanted is my chicken kosher?
Oh.
So go to the rabbi who will give you the answer you're looking for. Don't go to the rabbi who's really strict, you know. So if you know, there's someone in our synagogue who cares about halakha to some degree, and he also goes to Chabad. When he's asking about Passover things, I notice he comes to ask me. He doesn't go out to Chabad rabbi. So you know, you go to where you want to find where. So once you write it down, it changes a little bit. Even though what Rabbi Yehudah HaNasi did was, when he wrote it down, he didn't just say, okay, law number 1 is blah, blah, blah. He wrote, this person says this person, and this person says this person, and this person, you know, so they recorded various opinions, but they chose the people's opinions. There might have been others, and everybody has their favorites, and some people feel outside the canon, and so there is something that's lost when you
when you write it down. What you want then.
Yeah, it becomes do what you want. And so do what you want is good, but if you're trying to create a religion, you need a little bit of order.
Right.
And one of the things that Jews often will say is, right, where both our strongest point and also something that's a negative for us is we don't have a pope, right? We don't have a central authority. So when the Catholic Church wants to make a change, you know, the Pope decrees and people have to basically listen to it, and they follow, and we don't have a central figures. So, you know, we can, you know, the chief rabbi of Israel, even he says something, and you know, there's the Ashkenazi, and there's the Sephardi, and then there's other leaders who are even who have bigger shoulders, and you know, in the conservative movement, it's 10 times as ridiculous. We have a council of rabbis called the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards, and it has 20-something people on it, and they look at questions of law. But for that question of law to be published, I can't remember this. You have to only have 6 or 8 people say yes, and even if the other people say no, they still say it and publish it as it was accepted. And then you can have opposing, and then they even send, and even what the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards decides, is not binding on any conservative rabbis. Every conservative rabbi does what they want in terms of Jewish law.
But isn't this what people do? They choose the synagogue they want based on what they really want to
That's
do.
true, right? Yeah, you do, right?
They won't come here, they'll go to the Reform because it's less restrictive
Or we're not restrictive enough, and so they'll go
to Orthodox.
to Orthodox, and so you find your place. And Judaism has this idea of tradition being lived, right? Like, we're not a very dogmatic people, even, and so there maybe a final story about this. And we're talking about that, but there's in the last 50 years, even in the Orthodox world, they've become a lot more. Let's write everything down and make sure everybody's doing everything to the letter of the law, right? It's the phenomenon. People become newly Orthodox, and they want to do everything 100%. And there's a story about Soloveitchik's son, or Soloveitchik is one of the great Orthodox rabbis, and his son who was in a taxi with a rabbinical student, and he was asking him about. So there's a halacha, which a lot of people in the conservative world definitely do not do, but right, when you buy new vessels, when you buy new things, you have to toivel them. You have to take them to the mikvah. You have to put them in the mikvah, and that cleans them, because in case they were impure before, non-Jew touched them. Right, so that's what people did, and some still do, and there's all kinds of different ways of looking at it. But this person who was driving Soloveitchik's son said, do I have to toivel my can of Coke before I drink from it?
Yeah.
And because it's a vessel. And he said to him, you must be a newly Orthodox person, because nobody would ask such a ridiculous question. I mean, like live and let live a little bit. Not every point of law has to be lived in this way. There has to be an ease to life, which is sometimes what gets lost when you codify it. So in our generations, when in the Orthodox world, a lot more in the conservative world, but now you have 1,000 guides. This is what you do from the moment you wake up, and no deviating, and this is how you do everything. And so there used to be always a little bit of tug and pull. You watch what people do, how people act, and let's be a little bit lenient, right? And so we'll see with Rabbi Yehudah HaNasi, that even as he also did this, he fought to try and be a little bit lenient, because he realized that he was codifying things, and once you codify, and so he tried to do that, make it a little bit more livable, and in fact, even though we experience Judaism as or at least observant Judaism is making life less and less livable, they were trying to make it more and more livable compared to the Torah, right? Torah says you can't leave your house on Shabbat. They were saying, well, let's put a big string around the whole community and say this whole string is your house. It makes you can carry outside.
In Skokie, they have
the Skokie.
Yeah.
So the rabbis, from their point of view, are really trying to make it all livable, not make it less livable. And all right. So let's start, and we'll read a few stories. Let's read 286 to 287. Okay.
As soon as Rabbi Akiba died, Rabbi was born. At one time, the Roman government issued a decree prohibiting Israel from circumcising their children. During that period, our holy rabbi was born. His father, Rabban Simeon ben Gamliel, asked, how dare we set aside the decree of the Holy One and comply with the decree of these wicked ones? Immediately, he rose up and circumcised his son. When the magistrate in charge of the city heard of this, he had Rabban Simeon ben Gamliel summoned and asked him, why did you violate the emperor's decree? Rabban Simeon, we are only doing what the Holy One commanded us. The magistrate, I have great respect for you since you are the head of your people, but it is the emperor's decree and I cannot allow you to violate it. Rabban Simeon, what do you intend to do? The magistrate, we will send your family to the emperor and he will do what he wishes. So he dispatched our holy rabbi and his mother to the emperor. After journeying all day, toward evening, they arrived at the inn kept by the grandfather Antonius. And as it happened, Antonius was born at the very time our holy rabbi was born. Our holy rabbi's mother, held in affection by Antonius's mother, went to her at once. Upon seeing her distress, Antonius's mother asked, "What troubles you?" The mother of our rabbi, "Such and such that we do not circumcise was decreed against us, and since I did circumcise my son, he and I are being taken to the emperor." When the mother of Antonius heard this, she said, "If you wish, take my child who is not circumcised and give me your child." She did what was suggested, and the mother of our holy rabbi continued her journey. Upon her arrival, the magistrate in charge of her city brought her into the presence of the emperor. The emperor commanded that the child be examined, and they found him to be uncircumcised. At that, the emperor, furious at the magistrate, roared, "My decree concerns circumcised children, and you brought me an uncircumcised child." The emperor commanded that the magistrate be put to death, while holy rabbi and his mother were sent away in peace. When the two returned to the house of Antonius, his mother said, "Since the Holy One has wrought a miracle for you through me and for your son through my son, let them always be friends." The power of women.
The power of women, yeah. Outwitting the men.
Great story.
Good story, right? So it's showing you that they obviously came from a pretty important family, whatever it was, to have these relationships with the high Roman officials, and there we'll see later on. But there's so many stories of Rabbi Yehudah HaNasi having a relationship with the emperor in Rome, that there must have been some truth to it. It couldn't have been completely made up. And then his grandfather was a Rabban Gamliel, who you'll remember his father is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and his grandfather was a Rabban Gamliel who was deposed, if you remember, in the Beit Midrash, and that whole story that we read about. So he comes from a wealthy and very big lineage. Anybody else have thoughts or comments on this story? If not, we'll continue.
I would like to say something about that story. And the magistrate was doing his job, performing his office, and saw what he saw, and he didn't take any action except to send the offender or possible offender to the
Emperor.
It was the emperor himself, was it?
Yes.
Yes, I guess it is, because Marcus Aurelius. Yes, and all we know is that it says that the emperor declared that he be put to death. So it's interesting that there's no concern here that the magistrate, who was following the law and didn't have anybody put to death, he's put to death, and everyone just celebrates it. I just wanted to make that point. I don't think it's so obvious that the story is about. Well, it's a more problematic story than might be seen. That's all I want to say.
It's a strange story in many ways, and we would have maybe read earlier. There would have been some kind of real miracle, but there's no miracle here. There is a kind of outwitting of the men, right? And
precisely, yeah.
And the magistrate is the one who and it's true. The magistrate says, "I have great respect for you," and he sends him on to Rome and takes him to the highest authority. But it's like the personal relationships that are developed are more important than or outweigh the law. And I mean, we know at this time, right, how difficult it must have been for the Jewish people, because it was right after the Bar Kokhba revolt, and they were out, right? The Romans outlawed circumcision and outlawed the study of Torah. So not easy to do Judaism when you're not allowed to circumcise your children and not allowed to teach Torah or study Torah. And right, the Romans, they wanted to stamp out Judaism.
The hatred goes back so far, right?
Yeah, we survived.
We survived by duplicitous acts.
It's a trick.
There's something tricky and duplicitous about the way the survival occurred. Moses too, right?
Yeah.
The same kind of thing. It's a duplicitous act. It's an act against the structure, against the formal structure at that time that allows the survival of these key people. I
Beautiful.
don't know what that means.
That's a nice comparison, because it's also their women who again kind of out or are wise and make that happen. And I think this midrash is making something of that point, and there's a whole story also with Moses, that he was, according to tradition, Moses was born mahul, circumcised, and that the Messiah will be born circumcised too. It's a whole. So I'm not saying that about him, but there's something about the moment of circumcision and about a special child. All right, let's read 288 just because it gives us a little bit of. Go ahead, Norma, if you don't mind.
From the days of Moses to Rabbi, we find no other person in whom Torah and wealth were combined.
Yeah. And then, so that's just to let us know what kind of, they say he was wealthier than Solomon. He was so wealthy, had so much, he'd acquired so much wealth for himself. But then we'll see that his life isn't so easy. So let's go to 290, which is the next midrash. And this is going forward into his life. And I'm not sure why this book went so forward into his life so quickly. I think it does this because it's trying to give us a sense of his character. But what we can know is that, just to give you a little vignette into his life. So he was born into a family of rabbis, right? Because his grandfather and his father were both patriarchs of the Sanhedrin. And he grew up studying a lot, obviously, and he totally immersed in that world. He is one of his best friends was the son of Shimon Bar Yochai. So Shimon Bar Yochai, if you remember, he's the one who went into the cave and
lived there
with his son.
Yeah.
And remember, him and his son were there for over a decade, and their bodies were under the sand and all that story. So that son was one of his friends of Rabbi. So you see how it all interconnects. It's all a small world. 290.
290.
Do you want to read, or do you have
Yeah,
someone else? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, after Rav Eliezer, son of Rav Simeon, died, Rabbi sent messengers to propose marriage to his widow. She responded with the question, shall a utensil used for holy food be used for profane food? Rabbi sent messengers again. Granted that he may have outstripped me in learning, but was he at all my superior in good deeds? She replied, as for learning, I do not know whether or not he was greater than you, but that he was greater than you in good deeds, I know full well, since he invoked suffering upon himself. So, declaring, suffering is precious, Rabbi invoked suffering upon himself for 13 years, 6 through stones in the kidneys, 7 through scurvy. Rabbi Stewart was wealthier than King Shapur, so numerous were his cattle that when he set out fodder for them, their lowing could be heard for 3, it's supposed to be miles or something, and he deliberately set out their fodder just when Rabbi was entering the privy in order that Rabbi's cries of pains would not be heard. Yet even so, Rabbi's voice, lifted in pain, was louder than that of the cattle, and could be heard even by distant seafarers. Nevertheless, the sufferings of Rav Eliezer, son of Rav Simeon, were superior in virtue to those of Rabbi. For whereas those of Rav Eliezer, son of Rav Simeon, came to him directly in consequence of his love of God and departed in such love, those of Rabbi came to him as a result of an incident in which he acted improperly and departed as a result of another incident in which he acted properly. They came to him because of an incident in which he acted improperly. A calf was being taken to be slaughtered. Just then Rabbi was seated in front of the Babylonians' house of study in Sephoria. The calf broke away, hid its head under Rabbi's skirt, and lowed painfully as though pleading, "Save me." "Go," said Rabbi, "for this you were created." Then it is said in heaven, since he has no pity, let the suffering he invoked some time ago come upon him now. And they departed because of another incident in which he acted properly. One day, Rabbi's maidservant was sweeping the house. Seeing some young weasels lying there, she was about to sweep them away. "Let them be," he said to her, "for it is written, and his tender mercies are all over all his works." Then it was said in heaven, since he is compassionate, let us be compassionate to him.
Very, very strange story.
Strange,
Isn't it?
yeah.
Story?
Compassionate for weasels.
Very strange and very strange and weird story.
Very
Right?
weird.
Very weird. But actually a very important story in our tradition, for different reasons. But so what I wanted to talk about two things. One, the bigger theme is this idea of suffering, and that suffering is somehow virtuous or not virtuous, or that, and we can, that, I think that's an important conversation, and we can talk about afterwards too. But when I read this story, I was reminded, I don't know, if Phil, you were, or Norma, Norma, I'm sure you were in shul that day, but Phil, you were there. We had once, my sister-in-law asked me to bring a friend of hers who was the head of a vegan Jewish
Oh,
organization.
yes,
to
I
talk to her.
remember.
So he was a little militant,
Yeah.
and he was a little intense. But he quoted this story, because he quoted the story to show that God got so upset at Rabbi Yehudah for not saving this calf, right? What did Rabbi Yehudah say to the calf? He said, you know, for this you were created, go get eaten. And because of this, God rained down onto Rabbi Yehudah. And so he used this story to prove that there's an ideal of not hurting animals and not eating animals from this story. So that was, which is, I guess, an important text for, you know, I am a pescatarian. I'm not a vegan or vegetarian, but interesting, right? So that's the way that text was going to be used. So I wanted to bring that out. And I think that the second theme I think is interesting is also, here you have someone who has everything, right? He has wealth, he has power, he has prestige, but you know what? He doesn't have everything, because everybody has something, right? And so his health is so bad, his pain is so great that his cries of pain are heard throughout, even when they get all these cattle to try and make noise at the same time so people can hear him, which is another very strange image. But let's go, unless somebody else wants to talk about something else. But let's talk about this idea of suffering is precious. And you find this a lot among the rabbis of this time period, who are obviously going through a lot of challenge because they've witnessed a temple being destroyed in the generations. Then the people, the Bar Kokhba revolt that they saw as God's Messiah coming to save the Jewish people being crushed by the Romans and their hopes completely dashed. And just trying to continue despite it all. Well, does anybody find it's redeemable, that suffering is precious, or is it just hard to bear?
I have a question about this. I'm very confused as to what the suffering is, because the widow seems to imply that her dear departed husband suffered because of good deeds. That is, that what I'm reading it as, that he was doing good deeds that involved personal sacrifice in order to perform the good deed. But the other rabbi, is this Rabbi Yehudah that we're talking about? See, I'm even confused. The other rabbi.
So Rabbi Yehudah is often just referred to as rabbi, because as the composer of the Mishnah, he's our teacher. Rabbi means teacher, right? So they just call him rabbi. You know, so a
lot of rabbis. There are a lot of rabbis here. I'm just trying to focus.
He's just rabbi. Wherever it says rabbi, it's not like in our days where we just call a rabbi. Even when I was a rabbinical student, I went to a, not relevant story, but I'm bringing it up anyway. But I was an intern at a synagogue in Orange County, and I was in an evening, a Shabbat dinner, everybody was there, and there was some person who was new there, and he was introducing himself to everybody. And everybody said, well, I'm Joe, and I'm this, and then he introduced himself to me, and I said, well, I'm a rabbinical student. He said, you don't have to tell me your name. I know your name. Your name is Rabbi. So there's a sense of losing your name. But here the rabbi didn't have any name. He was just
Rabbi.
He was just Rabbi, even within the text. He's the rabbi, so to speak.
Okay,
yeah,
so what's confusing me is why is rabbi which is self-inflicted, right? He chooses, it says, Rabbi invoked suffering upon himself for 13 years. Invoked suffering on it. So I'm confused by that. Did he allow himself to develop kidney stones? Did he allow himself to develop scurvy? I mean, that's suffering that you have control over to some extent. And that's very confusing.
How does one have control over it?
Well, scurvy you can cure through diet, and kidney stones can also be either formed through diet or eliminated through diet. I don't see it at the same level. I don't see, especially the way this is written, where it says Rabbi invoked suffering upon himself. That's what I'm seeing. And I don't understand how that kind of suffering, to suffer for the sake of suffering.
One of the lady.
Because he
wanted
the woman. I don't see the type of suffering the same. I mean, if you're suffering because you're performing righteous deeds, okay, I can that's righteous suffering, but self-inflicted suffering, I don't see it on the same level. I'm confused.
He couldn't equal the lady's prior husband. The suffering is not the same degree, and it's not, shall we say, altruistic. It's not in the sense of being righteous and doing good deeds. He's suffering, but it's not the same level. I agree with you there.
What is it? It's very strange and nebulous how this suffering came about and how much he wanted it or didn't want it or what it was really about, right? The story is trying to give you its version, but as a reader, one is trying to understand, did he just happen to have these diseases that for some reason he couldn't get rid of? And so then, it's saying, well, he invoked it upon himself, or God invoked it, or he believed that it was invoked upon him for his sin of what happened with the calf, because that's when it started, and it happened to him. And there's a whole theology at this period about where does pain come from. I just wanted to give everybody a little bit of a background on it before we continue. And so there's the seminal story in it is a story where rabbis are arguing, and they say, well, if you're suffering in life, what's the first thing you do? The first thing you do is you kind of check your mezuzahs, right? You see if there's any mitzvah that's going on that you're not doing properly. And then the second thing you do, if you're suffering, is you check your own deeds. Is there anything that I'm doing in my life to bring the suffering? And then the third thing they say, well, if you find that you haven't done anything in your own deeds to merit suffering, they say, well, maybe God is giving you sufferings of love, which is God is making you suffer because God loves you, which is a very strange a very strange way of looking at it. But all these people, this is a moment of suffering for the Jewish people, and they're saying basically, why are we suffering? God, why is this happening? And so the question is, well, okay, I examine my deeds, but do my deeds really merit the suffering? And it's the biggest question, right? When people suffer, why is this happening?
But isn't that what we're asking right now? God, what do we do to deserve this?
Why once again the Jewish people going
being
to,
punished.
yeah. No, I met someone, on Shabbat, I knew him, who just come back from Israel and was in a horrible state, and he said, like, right now, reading prayers about God's mercy, very, very hard for him, because,
Well, and on TV this morning, I can't remember his name exactly, Benny Gantz.
yeah,
He said that this is gonna go on for years, he feels.
yeah. We're going for a long time. God willing not.
On the text here, if I may, this is somewhat comparable to the conflicting ideas about asceticism, I think, or maybe even parallel in Jewish tradition, where you have both an embrace sometimes of fasting, but it's not required, for example, which is very mild suffering, but it depends, and a rejection of the idea that unless you fit certain circumstances, special situations, like a Nazir, perhaps, you should avoid that, and you should embrace life and the pleasures of life. We have both of these things, and I think that's similar. And I don't know if there's any Christian influence here with these rabbis. I don't know, and I also don't know if it's a historical tale, of course. But by the time of the early church fathers, there's a tremendous enthusiasm at the time of the highest persecution. There's a kind of real enthusiasm for suffering and martyrdom. It's maybe too broad a statement, but it's very complicated that way. But I think there's a tension in Jewish thinking. Am I wrong about that?
I think we've seen it as well. We've seen it before. The rabbis and embracing poverty or not embracing poverty, or I think what you're hinting at is maybe here there's a criticism of, like, he brought the suffering into himself. It's like, you're wealthy, just be happy you're wealthy and enjoy your life. Don't try and make yourself suffer because you somehow want to be, even though you have everything, make yourself suffer so that you're on a similar level. But I think what it's saying is Rabbi Elazar, he suffered, and that was a natural suffering, right? The universe brought it to him, God brought it to him, and it was just part of his fate, so to speak. And here it's saying, well, what, but there is, but the other undercurrent that's interesting here is, if you show compassion, right? There's a voice from heaven. If you show compassion to other beings, then that you will get compassion back to you too, right? Because he didn't show compassion to this calf, for this you were created. It was a little harsh statement, even if okay, we eat meat or we eat whatever, but to say for this you were created was a little bit of a harsh statement to an animal, right? Yeah, you were created so that I can eat. So there's.
Okay, but who created the animals?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hashem. Exactly. So God is saying, well, if you're not showing mercy, so I'm not showing mercy. There's a very, 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 very complex thing that's all brought together in one short story, right? About what's proper and what's not proper. But
May I interject just briefly?
Yeah, go ahead. Please go ahead. Yeah.
So first of all, the first thing I want to say is I don't agree with asceticism per se, but to follow on what Nancy and Phil were saying about it, particularly Phil, in Christian asceticism, the idea, and I'm not familiar with Jewish asceticism, but in Christian asceticism, the idea behind all that flagellation and sticking things in yourself and all that other sort of stuff was to make yourself more humble and to turn your mind to God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of life. And, because the pleasures of life can turn your eyes and heart away from God, so to speak. And it's I don't buy into that personally, but that's the idea behind at least Christian aesthetic thought, not aesthetic, but ascetic thought. So I just wanted to toss that in. I don't know if it's similar in Jewish asceticism or not.
But thanks for bringing that up, and so beautifully said. Yeah, and I think that is the ascetic ideal, right? That somehow by humbling yourself, then you become a better vessel, and you understand other people's plight better, maybe, and God, and you become more of a vessel for godliness, right? For holiness. And when you think I'm the best and your ego is very high, then God doesn't come in. And I think that's across traditions. I mean, in Judaism, there is this tension between maybe even back to the beginning, two rabbis. Hillel was more like live, and remember he had this, I don't know if you remember, he had this whole thing about, he was in the Roman baths enjoying a nice spa, and they're like, how could you be doing this? He says, well, God also created the body, and you have to take care of your body. And that's kind of like just live your life, kind of enjoy it. And then there are other traditions, and there are, up and all through medieval times, there's all these ascetic and then there was many comments of very humble rabbis who did everything they could to be as humble as they could, right? To show their piety and their asceticism, and fasting often, or rejecting material goods except for Shabbat. But right on the other hand, right, Judaism has this command to not be too ascetic, because on Shabbat you're commanded to drink wine and eat a little bit of chicken at least, and eat some good food and delight in Shabbat and in the festival. So Rabbinic Judaism kind of, I'm not sure if as a reaction to the asceticism of early Christianity, which is what Phil was alluding to, kind of had this tension and never embraced asceticism quite as much. But it's still there in the ultra-Orthodox communities. And, one of our, I may have shared the story before, but a family friend of ours who came from a very, very old ultra-Orthodox lineage, and her grandfather, I think it was her grandfather, was a famous rabbi in the early 1900s in New York, who was just considered the pious of the pious, and books were written about him, and a lot of newly ultra-Orthodox people read a book about him. And he was famous for wearing 50 pair of tzitzit once. He would wear 50 pairs of tzitzit once. And so, of course, but our family friend would say, well, who the real hero was his wife, who had to wash the 50 pairs of tzitzit, and so the asceticism, there's always this tension about who ends up paying for the asceticism because we're also, asceticism is much easier if you're a monk or a nun, right? Because then you only have only yourself to be responsible for. But in Judaism, it's always believed in having a family. The asceticism of men, usually as heads of the household, usually often leads to suffering within the family. And there have been numerous Hasidic tales and other tales about it, and a famous tale by Agnon, I think it is, about a man who's very poor in Eastern Europe and has no more money left to buy food, and ends up selling his tefillin, his last valuable item. And what does he buy with his tefillin? Instead of buying food, he buys the most beautiful etrog. And so he comes home, and his wife sees, instead of buying food, he bought this beautiful etrog, and he's so excited. Look at this etrog that I built. And so she takes the etrog, and it falls out of her hand, and the pitom, right, the head of the etrog, which when it breaks makes the whole etrog no longer kosher, breaks. And so even the etrog is no longer valid, right? So it's kind of like a cautionary tale about, so there's always been this tension between asceticism and how much to embrace it. And so Elazar, and his father, who spent 11 years in the cave, they were real ascetics, right? And they were called to it by God. So if you're an ascetic, be called to it. If you're not an ascetic, don't be called to it. Seems to be part of the message here.
So how do you answer?
Yeah.
You made the statement that eat a little chicken, you said,
Yeah,
right? Okay.
yeah.
So that
Yeah.
guy who spoke,
Yeah.
Sarah's friend,
Yeah.
you know, how do you, if you're observant Jew
Yeah,
and you're not doing that, you're eating vegetables, how do,
yeah. So I mean, this is the debate for people who don't eat meat in the religious world. And the most famous one is Rav Kook, who was right. He was the first chief rabbi of early Palestine. He was, according to tradition, not according to tradition, he was a vegetarian. Some people say he ate a little bit of chicken on Friday night just to satisfy that. But he was a vegetarian, and he famously said that in the third temple, they're not going to have any more sacrifices. It's only going to be, the meal offerings. But in the Orthodox world, they very much disregard vegetarianism, or now it's a bit more open, but they were against it because they said, no, we're commanded, we have all kinds of songs on Friday night, fish and meat and this and that, and then
The Ashkenazi tradition, but in the
Ashkenazi
Sephardi tradition, maybe they're not eating chicken, maybe they're eating fish, maybe they're eating a vegetarian meal. I mean,
yeah,
it's easier to
Well,
keep kosher if you are vegetarian, right? Because then,
pescatarian, yeah.
uh,
Well, it's true. There's maybe more definitely less vegetables available in Ashkenazi culture than in Sephardic culture. But the Sephardic culture still ate a lot of meat to celebrate on. And then this is part of a culture of poverty, right? When you're poor, when you celebrate, when you have a special meal, you bring meat because that's how you mark it.
Do you know this story? The story of Job has something to do with this too. Job, for example, wasn't a willing ascetic. What happened is everything that we consider to be pleasurable and in the world got stripped off of him. Okay, so he loses his goods, he loses his children, he loses his health. Now he didn't choose this, so he's suffering. Now that particular story seems to say that when you're in a state when you can't even pay attention to the world, you find God, or you find something that gives you, or you haven't given up God in the process of having all this stuff taken from you. I think these guys are sort of kibitzers as far as the story we read today, as far as asceticism. Job was the real ascetic, okay? He had everything, lost everything, suffered in all three spheres, in the sphere of personal goods, in the sphere of his family, and the sphere of his health. So the whole thing is gone. And I think it's worthy to think about what that story is telling us.
but Job comes this close to cursing God because he can't understand.
But he doesn't. But
he doesn't, but he really, really walks.
Listen, so the story starts out that Job was a righteous man, a religious man, but Job ends up being more than that. He ends up being a wise man. So somehow this whole process of having everything taken away from him, the huge suffering that was entailed with that, ends up making him wise. And I've been spending a lot of time thinking about that, and I haven't yet turned the corner on figuring it out yet. But I think it's a worthy thing to try. And all of these minor forms of suffering, like kidney stones, etc., they're very, very far away from Job.
It's true. Well, so it's interesting. Thank you for bringing that up. And I think it is, there is, look, there's a truth that for many people, and I see this as a rabbi, that often it's when you have something in your life that goes off kilter that you begin to ask the big questions and you turn to eternal matters. And look, when do people come to Minyan to say Kaddish? But it's when they have someone who's died in their life. And there's many people, it's when they suffer a loss that they come to me or they come to other rabbis or whoever, and they start talking about what is life about, where, what, the bigger questions of life, which is what brings wisdom, right? Or brings, so it's one of the traditional answers to, well, suffering in the world, where suffering in the world is part of the school of life and teaches humanity something, right? That's the part of what suffering goes through. I mean, Job, the construction of the story of Job, I mean, I am personally more of a believer than many of my colleagues in almost everything in Tanakh. The story of Job doesn't feel very believable to me because of what happens, right? I mean, it's a meditation, right? It's a contemplation.
It doesn't have to be true. It doesn't have to be true.
Doesn't have to be true. But there are people who lose everything, right? And what is it? So there's a story of the Chofetz Chaim, right? I'm sure I've shared this story before, but there was one guy in his town who was really, really wealthy, and a philanthropist, a wonderful person, and eventually just loses everything. And so somebody comes to see the Chofetz Chaim and says, like, how is this possible? Why did God do this to me? He's such a good person. He did so much philanthropy. And he was just, why did he lose all his wealth? And so he thought for a while and he said, well, you know what? He learned how to serve God as a wealthy person. He graduated from that class. Now he needs to learn how to serve God as a poor person.
That makes sense.
So, the part of what I see in this story, reading between all the lines, and what I see about it is nobody has everything, right? And here he is, he has the wealth, he has this, but he can't marry the woman he wants to marry. He has these health issues, whether they're self-imposed or however they are. They're obviously very painful and make his life miserable. So he can't fully enjoy everything he has. And that it's a broken world, right? And the brokenness of the world is also what teaches us wisdom about what life is about, unfortunately. Sometimes we get to learn it without a brokenness, but unfortunately, usually when everything is well, we don't think about deeper things, we just enjoy. And so there is something about that. Underneath all these questions, the rabbis are asking, why is this happening to Jewish people? What do we tell our own people? And why is it happening to us? Why is it happening to me? And the answers are never straightforward, but they're things you have to meditate and contemplate on to get to. And I'm actually going to end us a little bit early because I have to quickly run home. And we still have a lot of Rabbi Yehudah to go through.
Do it again.
We'll keep on going. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you very much.
Very good.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.